Picture this. Winter, 30,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now Eastern Europe. The last mammoth the group saw was 3 weeks ago. The nuts and berries ran out long before that. The snow has been on the ground for 2 months. Children are crying. This is not a historical thought experiment. This was reality, something our ancestors faced regularly across hundreds of thousands of years. And they survived. Every single one of the 8 billion people alive today is a direct descendant of someone who made it through. Think about that for a moment. Every person on Earth is descended from people who survived millennia of irregular food supply, hungry winters, and failed hunts. No exceptions. Which means that inside every human alive today, something of that survival is still written. How exactly? That is one of the most fascinating stories in human biology. Because the answer isn't singular. There are several, and some of them are genuinely surprising. Hunter-gatherers starved less than farmers. This has been proven. Let's start by dismantling a myth right now. Popular culture has a very fixed image of prehistoric humans, permanently on the edge of starvation, chasing mammoths and dropping dead when they failed. Every day a battle for survival. Life nasty, brutish, and short. This is wrong. In 2014, Biology Letters, a journal of the Royal Society, published a major cross-cultural study by Burbesque, Marlowe, and colleagues. They analyzed famine frequency data across hunter-gatherer and agricultural societies worldwide. Their finding was counterintuitive. When controlling for habitat quality, hunter-gatherers experienced famine significantly less often than farmers. Why? Because a hunter-gatherer doesn't depend on a single crop. Their resource portfolio is diversified. Dozens of plant species, several animal species, fish, insects, roots, mushrooms. When one resource disappears, you switch to another. A farmer who loses the wheat harvest loses everything. A hunter-gatherer who loses the deer switches to rabbits, roots, and fish. 150 plant species in one camp. 23,000 years ago. The place is called Ohalo II, the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Israel. 23,000 years ago, a hunter-gatherer camp stood here. Then the lake rose and buried it, which is precisely why it survived so perfectly that scientists can reconstruct its inhabitants' diet with extraordinary precision. On the floor of one hut, they found 160,000 seeds and plant fragments from 150 different species. 150. Wild wheat and barley, wild oats, acorns, pistachios, grapes, figs, almonds, hawthorn, reed, aquatic plants, and much more. Plus fish bones, bird bones, and gazelle bones, plus a grinding stone with starch residue. They were milling grain into flour 23,000 years before the invention of agriculture. This isn't a primitive diet. It's a sophisticated, diversified food system that any modern nutritionist would consider exemplary in its variety. And here's the important implication for understanding hunger. When you have 150 species in your diet, none of them is critical. One grain species disappears, switch to another. Fish gone, eat more nuts. Game scarce, more plants. Economists call this risk portfolio diversification. Hunter-gatherers were practicing it thousands of years before the concept existed. Here's what's interesting. When people transitioned to farming, the diet contracted dramatically. Early farmers subsisted mainly on 2 or 3 grain crops. Analysis of Neolithic skeletons shows the transition was accompanied by declining health, cavities, bone disease, signs of nutritional deficiency. The new model was more stable in good years, but in bad years, catastrophic. That irony, agriculture built civilization and simultaneously made people more vulnerable to famine, is one of the great puzzles of human history. But even with all that diversity, hunger still came, especially in winter, especially in the north, especially when the climate shifted. How did people cope when hunger actually arrived? There are several answers. The first is biological. Your body knows how to starve. It has been preparing for millions of years. Human metabolism is not a machine that needs feeding every 3 or 4 hours or it breaks down. It is a system refined across millions of years of irregular eating, built specifically to survive periods without food. When food runs out, the body switches to fat reserves. This is called ketosis, a state in which ketone bodies produced from fat become the brain's primary fuel source. The brain switches to its reserve power supply and keeps working. This is not an emergency mode. It is a normal operating mode built into human physiology at the genetic level. The thrifty genotype hypothesis was proposed by James Neal in 1962 in the American Journal of Human Genetics. His argument? Genes that regulate fat storage with maximum efficiency were selected for across human evolution, enabling ancestors to rapidly store energy during abundance and slowly release it during scarcity. Which is why the human body is literally built to survive winter. Let's look at the numbers. An average person carries roughly 100,000 kilocalories in fat reserves. At a basal metabolic rate of about 1,800 kilocalories per day, that's more than 50 days without food at complete rest. With moderate activity, around 20 to 25 days, far larger than most mammals of similar size. We are built for long intervals without food. Our bodies remember this, even when we don't. What's also interesting, during fasting, it's not just energy balance that changes. Perception shifts, smells become sharper, peripheral vision improves, reaction time speeds up. These aren't random effects. They are a hunter preparing to find prey. But biology is only one part of the answer, because hunger isn't just a physical state. It's a social problem. The most important anti-hunger strategy was sharing food. Studies of hunter-gatherers worldwide, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Bushmen of the Kalahari, Aboriginal Australians, show the same pattern everywhere. Food almost never stays with the person who caught it. A successful hunter is obligated to share the catch with the entire group. This isn't a voluntary decision. It is a social norm, and violating it carries serious reputational consequences. Why share when you could keep it? Because today you caught the mammoth. Tomorrow, you're the one who didn't. Food sharing isn't altruism, it's mutual insurance, a system in which everyone pays in with good hunts and draws out in hard times. Research among the Ache of Paraguay, conducted over decades by anthropologists Hill, Gervin, and their colleagues, showed that hunters return empty-handed on a large proportion of their trips. Failed hunts are the norm, not the exception. Without a food-sharing system, the group would not survive. Every day, a hunter is either feeding others or being fed by others. Over the long run, it evens out. Food distribution was not just a custom. It was the first social insurance system in human history. Among the Hadza, a hunter who brings back a large kill distributes it to the last piece. He gets back only his share as a group member, but his reputation rises sharply, and the next time he's in trouble, he'll be helped first. This is called reciprocal altruism, a term introduced by biologist Robert Trivers in 1971. You help me today, I'll help you tomorrow. In a small group where everyone knows everyone, cheating the system is nearly impossible, which is why generosity and honesty in hunting societies aren't moral virtues in our sense. They are biological adaptations, directly tied to survival. The selfish hunter who hoards food might survive one good season. He'll die in the first bad one. The generous hunter dies surrounded by people who fed him when he was sick. Food storage didn't start with farming. It started 11,000 years before it. For a long time, it was assumed that food storage was an invention of agriculture. Grow a crop, harvest it, put it in the barn. Before that, people lived day to day. That's wrong. A 2019 paper in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology synthesized evidence for food storage among late Paleolithic hunter-gatherers in the Near East. Kalahari Bushmen have made biltong, dried meat, for millennia. The technique is simple. Slice meat into thin strips, dry it in the sun or over a fire. Dried meat keeps for months. Fish were smoked. Nuts and acorns were cached in the ground. Fat was rendered and stored in animal bladders. Back to Ohalo II. They didn't just find seeds there, they found evidence of grain processing. Husks burned off, kernels ground. Flour can be stored. That's already a strategic food reserve. 11,000 years before the first farmer, someone was sitting on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, grinding wild barley and thinking about winter. Now let's talk about what happened when the reserves ran out, when all the strategies had failed. This isn't a pleasant story, but it is the truth about how our ancestors survived. When there was nothing left, they ate things that aren't normally considered food. Famine is when the normal food hierarchy inverts completely. Tree bark, lichen, insects, larvae, earthworms, clay, chewed to create the sensation of a full stomach and to extract minerals. These are not hypothetical examples. These are documented practices among modern hunter-gatherers during food scarcity. Pine bark contains starch and sugars. Finns cut off during the Second World War used it as a flour additive, and it worked. Lichen, particularly reindeer lichen, is rich in carbohydrates and has served as emergency food for northern peoples for thousands of years. Insects contain more protein per gram than beef. 100 grams of roasted grasshoppers yields around 20 grams of protein. This isn't primitivism, it's knowledge. Knowing what you can eat in extremis is part of survival, passed down through generations. But there was one more strategy that rarely gets mentioned, because it seems counterintuitive. When hungry, move more, not less. The hunger paradox. Less food, more movement. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. But it is biological reality. When food is scarce, sitting still and conserving energy is the losing strategy. Food isn't going to come to you. You have to go find it. Which is why the human body under fasting doesn't immediately shift into maximum conservation and apathy, as you might expect. Instead, in the early stages of fasting, alertness increases, concentration sharpens, and physical activity rises. This has been studied. In 2024, a research team published a study in which participants undertook 8-hour hiking journeys under severely restricted caloric intake, simulating a hunting expedition. Result? Cognitive function was maintained, and physical endurance held up significantly longer than predicted. The fasted body enters hunting mode. Heightened focus, sharpened senses, readiness to cover long distances. This is not an invention. It's an evolutionary adaptation. The ancestor who lay down and waited when hungry died. The ancestor who got up and went looking survived. There's practical confirmation from modern clinical literature. People who practice intermittent fasting, deliberate periods without food of 18 to 24 hours, frequently report heightened mental clarity and physical energy precisely during the fasting window, not after eating. This isn't placebo. It's that same hunting physiology activating as blood glucose drops. Ketone bodies, which the brain uses instead of glucose, are a cleaner and more efficient fuel for neurons. Some neuroscientists suggest the brain actually functions better in mild ketosis. Your ancestors thought more clearly when they were hungry. That is not a coincidence of evolution. That was the design. And there's one more strategy to discuss. This one isn't about physical survival. It's about informational survival. The most valuable resource in a famine wasn't strength. It was knowledge of where to look. Picture your group going through a bad season. The usual hunting grounds are empty. The familiar berry patches aren't producing. In that moment, the most important person in the group isn't the strongest hunter. It's the oldest one. Elderly group members remembered previous hungry years. They knew where to find roots when everything else ran out. They knew which direction the herds had moved the last time there was a winter like this. They knew which plants were edible in an emergency and which were poisonous. This isn't speculation. Anthropologists have documented a consistent pattern among modern hunter-gatherers. Decisions about migration and food finding are made by drawing on the memory of elders. Evolutionary biologist Kristen Hawkes of the University of Utah, the author of the famous grandmother hypothesis, proposed that the long post-reproductive lifespan of women is an evolutionary adaptation tied to their role as keepers of critical survival knowledge. A grandmother who remembered the last famine literally saved lives. In a group with no writing, no books, no maps, a living elder's memory is the survival library. There's a specific example. Among Aboriginal Australians in Central Australia, ethnographers have documented cases where a group found itself in an arid area with no visible water source. Young hunters were preparing to die. An elder woman in her 80s pointed to a specific patch of ground. "There is water underground here. I was in this place as a child." They dug and found it. This is not legend. It is a documented ethnographic case. Hawkes and her colleagues found that in groups with grandmothers present, grandchild survival rates are significantly higher than in groups without them. Not only because grandmothers provide childcare, though they do, but because they remember what the young have never experienced. Human longevity, we live significantly longer than most primates of our size, is probably partly explained by exactly this. An old person who lived through 2 or 3 famines is a survival asset for the entire group. But what happened when hunger became truly severe? When people were dying? This is where we enter one of the darkest topics in prehistoric anthropology, and it needs to be discussed honestly. Cannibalism as a survival strategy. The facts without sensationalism. This is an uncomfortable subject, but it is documented. At several Paleolithic sites, human bones have been found bearing marks characteristic of butchery, cut marks from stone tools in the same locations as on animal bones, deliberate bone breaking to access marrow. Gough's Cave in the United Kingdom, around 14,000 years ago. Grandolina in Spain, around 800,000 years ago, at a site associated with Homo antecessor. A number of other locations across Eurasia spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Whether this represents ritual cannibalism or survival cannibalism in conditions of extreme famine is a separate question, and one without a definitive answer. Anthropologists debate both possibilities. But the fact of human body processing similar to animal butchery is confirmed. The important thing to understand, this was not the norm, and it was not routine practice. It was an extreme measure, an exception, but an exception that occurred, and one that appears to have been part of the survival toolkit when every other option had been exhausted. Let's return to what was happening at the level of the body. Because hunger doesn't just change behavior, it changes physiology, and some of those changes became permanent features of human biology. Your body remembers hunger, even when food is everywhere. Let's return to James Neal's thrifty genotype hypothesis. Its core finding: genes that conferred advantage under conditions of irregular food supply, the ability to rapidly accumulate fat during abundance and slowly release it during famine, were selected for across human evolution and became embedded in the human genome. These genes are still working in us right now. In a world of constant food access, they produce what we call a tendency toward weight gain, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes. These aren't diseases of civilization in the strict sense. They are adaptations to famine, running idle in a world without famine. Your craving for sugar and fat isn't a character flaw. It's your ancestors, who survived a winter 30,000 years ago because they could rapidly accumulate weight when food appeared. Modern medicine, in this sense, is fighting not a lack of willpower, but the legacy of millions of years of irregular eating. Hunger as the engine of human culture. And finally, probably the most important observation. Hunger didn't just kill or not kill. Hunger created. The need to store food produced the technologies of drying, smoking, grinding, and fermentation. The need to expand territory in search of food drove humans to populate the entire planet. The need to coordinate hunts for large game demanded the development of language and social organization. Ohalo II in Israel, the camp where wild barley was being milled 23,000 years ago, is not just an attempt to eat. It's proto-agriculture. People were observing how grains grew, returning to the same locations, possibly deliberately scattering seeds. Researchers from Tel Aviv University found traces of 13 weed species at the site, plants that grow only near cultivated fields. Which means that 23,000 years ago, someone may already have been farming, 11,000 years before we officially call it agriculture. Hunger forced humans to think about tomorrow, and thinking about tomorrow is civilization. So how did ancient humans deal with hunger? 5 ways. Biologically, the body knows how to fast, switching to fat reserves and running on minimal input. It's written in the genes. Through diversity, 150 plant species in one camp means no single species is critical. The portfolio absorbs any loss. Through social exchange, sharing food is buying insurance against the days you come home empty-handed. Through storage, dried meat, smoked fish, milled grain, thousands of years before the granary or the refrigerator. Through knowledge, someone's grandmother remembered where the edible roots grew during the last famine. That memory was worth lives. Every time you feel genuinely hungry, real hunger, not just, I could eat, your body is activating systems that helped tens of thousands of generations before you survive. Sharpened attention, the impulse to move, heightened focus. That's not weakness. That's inheritance. Here's one more thing worth sitting with. In wealthy countries today, obesity is a mass phenomenon. Type 2 diabetes is an epidemic. Metabolic syndrome affects hundreds of millions of people. Most doctors explain this as too much food and too little movement. That's true, but it's an incomplete answer. The complete answer is this: our bodies are living in a world they were not designed for. They were designed for a world where food appears and disappears, where feast is followed by famine, where you have to move to find the next meal. Instead, food is everywhere, always, and movement is optional. Our genes haven't caught up. They need tens of thousands more years. So the next time you feel hungry an hour after a meal, know this: that's not you being weak. That's your ancestors, the ones who survived a winter 30,000 years ago, still doing their job. And the fact that you can read about this right now, well-fed and comfortable, is the result of every single one of them making it through.